Well, very good. This is Denis Simon here at Duke University, and we are going now to proceed ahead with our panel of three very well-known and experienced experts on the science and technology relationship. It is common during these town halls that we pick off one particular issue and use that as the focal point for our discussion. So tonight, with your questions and comments, if you'd focus in largely on S&T related matters, that would help guide the discussion and give us a greater focus, given the breadth of issues that we might possibly discuss. And so our three panelists tonight, first, let me introduce them. They're all old friends, and I was counting today between us, we have over 150 years of China S&T experience. So I guess that makes us pretty old, veterans. And when they say old China hands, you're probably looking with some respect to one of the younger members, really people who've spent a lot of time working on these issues. Our first panelist is Professor Richard Pete Suttmeier. Professor Suttmeier is a professor emeritus at the University of Oregon, where he spent many years working on U.S.-China relations and the evolution of Chinese S&T policy. If there is a dean in the field of Chinese S&T studies, it is Pete Suttmeier. I know when I was a graduate student at Berkeley, Pete and I met at the East-West Center, and this listening to what he was doing catapulted me to have a greater interest, and ended up being one of his many disciples. So it's great to have Pete here. Our second speaker is Mark Cohen. Mark is at the University of California at Berkeley, where he is a senior fellow at the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology, and he is also the director of the new Berkeley Center on Law and Technology in Asia. It's a new IP focused project that he directs. He also teaches IP law at UC Berkeley and international trade law. Mark is also a distinguished veteran of the China field, particularly in terms of IP issues, and he served as the U.S. representative for intellectual property and patent issues in the U.S. Embassy for a number of years. Seems like another life, I know, to Mark. And then finally, our third panelist is Paul Triolo, who is a senior expert in the Eurasia Group, where he leads that firm's practice on geotechnology policy issues, including issues such as cybersecurity, internet governance, AI and big data, 5G technology, and fintech and blockchain technology. And so the three panelists will engage in this discussion, and I will try to guide them through it with some hopefully useful and interesting questions. Before we go forward, I want to just take a minute to thank APSI at Duke for helping to put this together and working with the National Committee for U.S.-China Relations, and also some of our co-sponsors, the Center for Science and Technology Policy at Duke, the Center for Innovation Policy at the Law School, and at UC Berkeley, the Center for Law and Technology. And I thank all of them for agreeing to support this effort. So let's get underway and start our discussion. This is a question for all three of you, and it just requires a very brief answer. If you had to take one word or one or two words to describe the current state of U.S.-China science and technology relations, what word would you use? And why did you choose that word? So let me start with Pete, and then we'll go to Mark, and then we'll go to Paul. So Pete, you're up.
Sad.
What? Say it again. Say it again.
Sad.
Sad. Okay.
Disappointing.
Okay. Mark.
Not dead. Sad. I'm going to use more than one word, and disengaging, but not as profoundly as you might think.
Okay. Paul.
You're
unmute.
I would say troubled, but you know, on the mend potentially in some areas. And
on the mend, okay. So if we were sitting here 5 or 6 years ago, would each of you have chosen the same word, or what word would you had used at the time? Pete?
Probably interesting patterns of engagement with uncertainties.
Okay.
Naive with lots of potential.
With lots of potential. Okay. And Paul?
I would have said collaborative, but without much reflection on consequences.
Okay, moving along. Okay, and then the last part of this is that we have a new Biden administration. And imagine we were sitting here near the end of the first Biden administration, and I asked you to summarize where we've come. What word might you use to say where we're going to be 3, 4, 5 years from now, as we look at the opportunities and also the plethora of problems that everyone keeps talking about? And let's go in reverse order this time. Paul, what would you say?
I would say a proper equilibrium.
Okay. Mark?
More strategic.
More strategic. Okay. Pete?
Confused and uncertain.
Confused and uncertain. Okay. Well, see, that gives us a great range of perspectives about where we're going to be in a few years. So let me start with Pete, with a big, broader question. How did we get to this point where we seem to be on a road that, even as now you've suggested, we're going to still be confused and uncertain a few years ago? What can you briefly summarize kind of the last 30, 40 years in a few sentences about where we've come in the U.S.-China S&T relationship, from the signing of the bilateral accords all the way through to June 4th, all the way through to the current Trump administration, and how we got to where we are?
Well, when you think about this, the dynamics of the relationship have changed so dramatically. So when we first started back in 1978 or thereabouts, the science and technology relationship was part of a normalization process and normalization assumptions. Then gradually, China upped its game, became more interesting. The relationship was not as asymmetric as it was at the outset. The question of having a kind of interesting creative engagement with China became more and more, I think, the dominant way of thinking about it. And then, of course, as Paul kind of alluded, we didn't always think about the consequences. And now, in the last, 5 years, I would say, part of it goes back before Trump, but certainly after Trump, the whole relationship is seen as threatening. And, that's sort of understandable the way things have gone, because, again, China continues to up its game. It continues to make progress on its research and development and its technological development and innovation. And given the ways in which the political relationship has begun to unravel a little bit, it makes it much more difficult to think about having intimate kinds of science and technology relationship. One should note that, before the Trump administration, we had already reached a point where the S&T relationship was very, very dense, very, very intensive, as measured by government-to-government agreements, corporate investments and R&D activities in China, technology transfer, and then, of course, the very extensive presence of Chinese students and scholars at American universities. When we talk about decoupling, we really need to think about how dense this thing had become. Now, the reason I guess I said, that looking forward, we're going to be confused and uncertain, is in part because the a few things have sort of come together, right? One is just the nature of technical change and what that has meant for a variety of science-based technologies. Second of all, the growing kind of nationalism and sense of security consciousness in both countries and indeed around the world, I would say. And so what we're winding up, I think, with at least those two things together is a kind of confluence of forces that sort of challenges a lot of assumptions about how in the world you conduct cooperative relations with another country. I just think that we have now entered into kind of a very new era, and it's confused and uncertain.
Okay, fair enough. Well, in 2006, the Chinese government launched the medium to long-term science and technology plan, and out of that came this emphasis on so-called indigenous innovation. And then a few years later, they launched the Made in China 2025 program. And both of these obviously created a great deal of negative response in the West, and particularly not only in the US government, but also among US business. Paul, can you just tell me what do you think made China, embark down this path, and why did it receive such negative feedback when it was announced, and really raised a great furor across the entire span of U.S. companies doing business in China?
Well, I think lots of reasons here. I think the big difference in sort of the S&T relationship is that the science is one thing, and as Pete mentioned, there is a long history of interaction on big issues like climate change, for example, under the Gore administration, government relationships. But as we get into the late 2000s and into the last decade, the big difference is that China now starts to develop technology companies that are starting to play a much bigger role globally. Huawei comes to mind in particular, of course. And so the issue then becomes, it's not just a matter of collaboration on sort of the basic science front, but now Chinese companies are becoming competitive in areas of technology that have traditionally been dominated by U.S. companies. So then when you have, for example, Xi Jinping come to power in 2012, and you have things like the Snowden incident, and so Xi then sort of becomes the purveyor of large programs like Made in China 2025, like Belt and Road, like national strategies around AI eventually, and semiconductors, for example. And so the nature of the sort of the relationship then has changed fundamentally. And also, of course, Xi has done other things in the political realm, which also did not go over in the West, and clamping down on and more further censorship, and clamping down on sort of dissent at universities and other places. So the combination of sort of China's rise and company rise as technology competitors to the U.S., and then coupled with these big programs that you can argue over how aspirational they are. Things like Made in China 2025, right? But things like the National Semiconductor IC Investment Fund, for example, ended up putting huge amounts of capital also behind some of these initiatives, and this generated a big response. For example, in the Obama administration, when some of that government funding was proposed to be used to acquire U.S. tech companies like Micron, for example, and a leading memory maker. So in the Xi era, we've gone, the landscape has changed fundamentally by both the rise of Chinese technology companies and then the sort of the rise of the digital economy in cyberspace, so that suddenly having companies that are competing in the digital economy is a huge issue, and that brings along with it all these national security concerns that we've seen, for example, in the Trump administration around Huawei, around supply chains that center in China, et cetera. So some of these things go back a long way, the sort of origins of them, like to the WTO and whether China was abiding by the rules. But under the Trump administration, a lot of these things have come together around technology, whether it's sort of market access and reciprocity that we talked about earlier, that I think that during the town hall, one of the big themes was reciprocity, and then things like supply chains and export controls. And then I think the other final thing I'll mention is that and particularly in the last 2 years, there has been the rise of this meme that now all of a sudden the U.S. and China are locked into this struggle over the technologies of the future. I mean, and to me, this is funny. I mean, in some sense, back in the 1980s, China was viewed as uninnovative and copycat and couldn't do anything right. And now all of a sudden, the U.S. The meme in D.C. at least is we're locked into this struggle with China over the technologies of the future. Artificial intelligence and quantum computing. And not only that, it's that the corollary is the Chinese will misuse those technologies in ways that don't comport with Western values or Western democracy. So we can't let our data, for example, run over 5G networks built by a Chinese company, and we don't want AI and AI regulatory issues to be set or to be influenced by the Chinese government, for example. So now that's the kind of thing that's not going to go away either, even in a new Biden administration, because the sort of zeitgeist now in DC is that China's rise in the technology domain is a threat, and so now the debate is over the parameters of how do you deal with that, and without sort of also at the same time damaging the U.S.'s own innovation capacity because of that interaction that Pete mentioned earlier. The sort of intertwining is so deep that if you want to uncouple that, you got to figure out how to do it in a nuanced way and not sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater, and protect national security while sort of protecting economic security and not sort of expunging or decoupling in a way that the benefits of the intertwining of the economies is lost. And that's where the debate is right now in DC, and it'll continue under the Biden administration.
One of the most contentious areas around all of this conflict is the issue of intellectual property. Mike Lampton, who's now at Stanford, wrote a book on U.S.-China relations, and he said it's hard to distinguish whether China is a rule maker, a rule breaker, or a rule taker. And IP seems to be one of those areas, at least the general perception is China is a big rule breaker. Mark, you've been following this for a long time, and we look at the history of how all intellectual property has developed around the world, first from the UK to the US, with the US being the one who was not always playing above board. We saw the role of the Japanese versus the US, and then we saw the four dragons, and now we've seen China. Basically, everyone plays fast and loose until they have some skin in the game, and then all of a sudden they become a serious player. They watch more carefully about how they treat their own IP and have something to look at. Maybe you can give us a sense, how, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being really bad, how serious today is the IPR problem, and how does that compare to where it had been, let's say, a half a dozen years ago?
A great question, and kind of tough to answer because IP is such a diverse area over different rights and different concerns. I would say that overall, notwithstanding the rhetoric from the Trump administration, and particularly if you're not in a field that has a great deal of sensitivity, because it's at the core of Made in China 2025 or some of the other plans that Paul spoke about, you'll probably do okay in protecting your IP rights in China. In fact, there's an increasingly vocal community that says it's easier to protect IP in China and less expensive and faster than in the United States, where we have a very corporatized and expensive IP environment. So, if you put it all together and you considered also issues, some of the more notorious issues involving companies like Micron, but also issues involving licensing standards, essential patents, and other technology that's core to some of China's development needs or coveted by China's growing technology giants. You'd probably come up with China being at somewhere around a 4, if 10 is the worst. I would say China's on the positive side of the equation, and in some fields doing very well, and some fields doing pretty badly. But on balance, it's generally been positive. And I think you've seen a dramatic transition in the past 5 years to 15 years, perhaps, in China's IP environment. Again, not all of it positive, not all of it the things we would have wished for. And frankly, we should have also been careful in some of the things we wished for. But some of the things China has done of its own volition, like having specialized IP courts and specialized IP judges, and specialized IP faculties, specialized IP newspapers, journalists, and having IP in the Gaokao, the National College Entrance Exam, having it really penetrate deep into society, are the kinds of things that actually can make an American IP lawyer jealous. The courts are fast, the judges are expert, the cost is low, you have rights that are tremendously inexpensive, and you have despite all the rhetoric, and we heard some of it from Paul, and frankly, I often engage in it about China Inc. and these massive tech companies that are going to outcompete the US and reduce us to poverty or some kind of horrible future. The Chinese IP environment is remarkably favorably tilted towards the little guy. Now, 30% of the patents are filed by individuals. In the US, it's about 6. If you lined up all those individual inventors in China, there will be more of them than the total number of patents filed at the USPTO. So does that benefit Westerners? Not necessarily. We're a very small part of that cohort. So and also this rhetoric around, the US did it with the Brits and the Japanese did it, and in Taiwan they did it, the Koreans, look at where they are now. Well, we have this thing, still exists, called the WTO. We've rarely used it against China, but it is at its basic level. It wasn't a bad agreement. Maybe we didn't anticipate China's rise so quickly, but we really didn't necessarily cultivate the kind of IP regime in many of our engagements with China that would make it easier for foreigners to litigate, to protect their rights as a private property right. You go back to the Phase 1 agreement last year, what we did was actually enhance the role of the state. The very thing that is giving us acid in our stomach, which is 5-year plans and administrative agencies dictating terms of agreements and interfering in commercial transactions, is actually what was largely enhanced in that Phase 1 agreement, whereas our own values are promote the markets, promote transparency, promote good courts. All that really has never really been leveraged. The result is that foreigners are a very small part of the Chinese IP docket, less than 1% of the court docket. In many cases, we don't even have a very good insight into how well or badly foreigners are doing in the courts. We know a lot more about how Chinese are doing, including how small Chinese entities are doing.
So we've seen a proliferation of Chinese patents. And this is one of those areas where seems to be a discrepancy. We've got this technological rise of China. China's generating more and more of its own IP. And then you have half the people saying, most of these are junk patents. They're not really worth very much. And then on the other hand, we're worried about this Chinese technological threat. So I'm just curious, maybe Paul, how do you mesh these two together? And maybe you can have a comment from Mark and Pete as well on this. But there seems to be this conflict in terms of, on the one hand, the system is working better, but on the other hand, it's also throwing out a lot of garbage. So maybe we can see why that's the case.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question, and I'd love to hear Pete and market. I mean, the whole issue of how do you translate research into commercial patents that are then become competitive and viable. I think the examples we do have that I'm most familiar with are in areas like 5G, where Chinese companies, and 4G and 3G to some degree, the mobile communications realm, where over the last decade, Chinese companies, and not just Huawei, but a whole range of Chinese companies and organizations have moved into sort of that sphere and are contributing, intellectual property at bodies like the 3GPP for 5G in a very cutting edge area, and it's a very complicated area to sort of parse out how good patents are. But basically, it is sort of a contest of where the best technology in most cases does sort of tend to win out because of the way the patents process is run. So that's at least a court of IP that you can, where there's some objective criteria. Now there's still a lot of controversy over whether whether companies like Huawei and the Chinese government sort of flood the zone and try to influence that. But by and large, in my discussion, some of our clients, for example, are very much involved in 3GPP. The feeling is that Chinese companies come to the table ready to play ball and offer their IP on these FRAND principles, and they're very much playing the game of trying to get, for example, standard essential patents for these very competitive commercial networks, so that they can benefit from royalties. They were sick of paying Qualcomm and other Western companies, huge royalties in the sort of 3G and 4G world. And so they made a conscious decision, the companies, and, of course, with some backing by the government, but the companies are really the major players here. They have to come and they have to bring real technology and compete in a sort of international, global market here. So you can argue that 5G and the 5G standards process has been successful. And in a sense, the U.S. government has urged China back in the day to participate in this. I mean, if you remember the whole 3G standards issue, which became sort of a major issue, and nobody wanted to go back to the world where we had competing standards and you had to have different phones to operate in Europe and the US and in China. And so as we move into the 4G and 5G arena, we have a global standards. Chinese companies participate very competitively, and at least in that arena, they're very successful. Now, that's again a sort of a small subset of the broader patent issue that you raised, Dennis. And I think it's a good question in other arenas, how this plays out. In AI, and for example, there's a tremendous amount of patenting going on in China by companies like Alibaba. The State Grid Corporation is filing massive amounts of patents. And again, tricky to say how good these are, how useful they are. And how they'll play out in that arena. But I think that the Chinese get the patent game in these commercial areas and want to play it, and their companies are being very good at that. They're definitely competing and bringing to the table, at least internationally, good technology. And then in these other domestically, there's as Mark mentioned, I mean, there's a huge effort to sort of play the patent technology and protect intellectual property around patents. And so that, but they're new to the game. And so this is definitely very much a work in progress.
Pete, you've worked a lot on technical standards. Do you see the same activism by China in terms of global governance about technical standards? Because obviously that's an area that used to be buried in the back room, and lots of books by experts, and never seemed to make the light of day in terms of the sexy issues. But all of a sudden, over the last half a dozen years, technical standards have been a mainstay of Chinese concern. And do you think that this is going to continue to be where China wants a seat at the table in order to affect how these standards evolve in the future? And maybe that's a point of resistance in terms of Western countries who have really had an open field in terms of determining those standards up until recent years.
Well, I was when I started thinking about standards, a couple of things. When I first started doing some work in that area, focusing mainly on the WAPI standard, if anybody even remembers WAPI these days. That was a kind of wireless communication standard. And I remember interacting with a very smart Tsinghua graduate and then PhD from the UK about all of this. And, we said, well, why, what's this all about with WAPI and all that kind of stuff? Because remember, this was both the IP side and the standard side were all kind of new to China, right? And when it comes to the 80s, certainly 90s, they start moving up. And then, in the early 2000s, you begin to see this growing attention to standards questions. And part of it is, I think, as Paul alluded, had to do with, resistance to having to pay royalties for standard essential patents and the standards that we're working. So what do we see? We see gradually, going back to my Tsinghua interlocutor, he was saying at the time, even though the WAPI stories seem to have really very little merit in terms of either technology or economics, but he was saying that, this is a learning experience for China, that they're going through this process of learning about the standardization system and how it works internationally. And I think that was an interesting point and very prescient in a way, because clearly we've seen since then this sort of increasing attention and sophistication to China. And, China has encouraged getting involved in international standard setting and actually becoming kind of a leader in it. And one of the things we should remember in this session, and for those who listen, is that China now has a long-term standards development policy and strategy that focuses in on 2035, when they want to have, China as the dominant setter of standards, technical standards. Now that, we have to see that in the context, again, of IP. So, intellectual property law and intellectual property itself was all kind of new to a socialist China coming out of pre-reform China. But then gradually, what do we see? We see more and more attention given to IP, as Mark points out, with all kinds of special capabilities being developed domestically. And we see the development of an IP strategy, a national IP strategy. So, for me, this is called kind of a trajectory, right? And starting from a very low set of assumptions that are based on an old economy model that doesn't exist anymore. And China then sort of monitoring the international environment and how it works and beginning to strategize on becoming important, if not dominant, players in those areas, And so, yeah, you're going to have lots and lots of junk patents. But on the other hand, we're seeing, creative innovations that are coming along that then can get legs in international standard setting bodies and can get legs in markets and products and so forth and so on. So,
yeah, let me just add, I think it's, that there's a narrative too that somehow China is out to dominate these standards bodies. And again, going back to the whole 5G issue, I really think that's a red herring because, again, Chinese companies have to come and they have to have real IP to bring, right? And in fact, the companies that are coming are very, the most successful tech companies that have developed their own IP through investing heavily in R&D. Now, maybe they had some advantages in a protective system and they were favored in terms of the commercial market in China, and so had more money to invest in R&D. You can make that argument, but they're not flooding the zone just with government officials to sort of change the standards process. Now, in the U.S., the narrative has developed that maybe going forward, since the U.S. doesn't like the fact that Huawei and ZTE ZTE might have, say, 40% of the standard essential patents around 5G, that maybe that the U.S. should try to push for another alternative path to standards for 6G, for example. And when we talk to industry, people are just like, what do you mean by that? I mean, this is the goal was to get China and Chinese companies into the international standards game, so that they would to improve things for everybody and interoperability, et cetera. And now you want to try to sort of fork the standards process. So there's a lot of discussion of this in the Trump administration. I think under Biden, there'll be sort of a reevaluation of this. But if you look at, for example, the language in a lot of legislation and some documents that the Trump administration has put out on 5G, it seems to hint that, hey, maybe we want to think about another standards process for mobile communications going forward. And I think that's there are lots of different ways to talk about standards, but in terms of international standards in an arena like mobile communications, it's really important. And Chinese companies are really playing important roles there. And I think we have to be very careful to think about sort of decoupling in the standards regime. And then we can talk about other areas of decoupling. But I think, I for one don't want to have multiple devices to travel in Asia when I'm there. And I think nobody wants to go back to those days. But that's where we are right now because of some of the broader issues around U.S.-China relations.
So I'm going to have to play the resident cynic here. And it's not because I'm a big fan of Donald Trump, but the data does not look like a benign actor in terms of participation in standards bodies or protecting IP, or now engaged in fair cross-licensing of technology. I mean, until 3 or 4 years ago, Taiwan was a far bigger market for U.S. technology, patented technology, than China. Far bigger in terms of gross amount and far bigger in terms of licensing to unrelated parties. So most of the technology transfer to China was between related parties, parent subsidiary, and in Taiwan it was merchant licensing. And Japan was twice the size. This is only a recent phenomenon where China has started. And it's hardly an environment that's fair or equitable. And if you looked at the 2 recent anti-suit injunctions issued by Chinese courts, one against the New Delhi High Court to stop India from granting a license or determining royalty rates for a technology licensed in India. So China wants to be the global norm setter in this area. China wants to determine the price. And by the way, if you're making 90% of the cell phones in the world, you have pretty good leverage in determining what you want to charge for technology. Let's be realistic about that. 90% of them are produced in China, and you get an injunction in a Chinese court 97, 98% of the time. You're going to determine the price of all foreign technology unless you can find a way out of it. But let's also double back a little bit. This issue about quality of patents. This is not an easy issue, but it's also one that certain aspects have to be debunked. One of them is that China's behavior is aberrant in standard setting bodies. For example, the typical Chinese patent will be submitted to 5 or 6 technical specification bodies on 5G. The typical foreign patent holder will have 2, maybe 3. Why? Because they're encouraged to go to as many places as possible. Being accepted as a CEP is not a hallmark of quality. Anybody can do that. In many cases, you're submitting patent applications and not issued patents, so you don't even know about the grant. Furthermore, with the exception of Huawei and ZTE, there's not a lot of foreign filing going on. Another place where China is utterly aberrant is in PCT applications. This used to be a hallmark of high quality patents. Filing a PCT patent, which goes through the World Intellectual Property Organization, and then gets filed through multiple countries. The average Chinese PCT application is only filed in one country. One country. The typical one for the United States is 2 or 3. For Norway, Sweden, Israel, you're going to be talking about 6 or 7. So you have real qualitative issues here. I'm not saying that China doesn't innovate, but basically due to subsidies, including subsidization or participation in standard setting bodies, subsidization in filing PCT applications, lack of subsidization for maintenance of the patents. So China has a pretty high die-off rate of patents. You have a state-sponsored approach to patent prosecution. Not only is that bad for the rest of the world, it encumbers the quality of really good Chinese innovation, because you have to go through a patent thicket that is burdened by a lot of junk. Just a lot of junk. So if you were to ask me, is China really innovating? They're certainly participating in standards bodies and increasingly even in open source projects, but there's so much junk cluttering it. And not only that, the Chinese government is leveraging that to say, look, we're innovating. We're a major player now. And that is utterly wrong. Quality does not determine the quantity does not determine quality of innovations. We have to use other metrics, and that takes time. So let's drop off the quality thing as a metric. That's buying into a narrative that is a rabbit hole that brings us into a wrong direction.
Absolutely. Yeah. Quality, those are two different issues, information and quality.
I wouldn't disagree with that either. But, you know, I think my point really was this notion of a strategy, right? That I'm not sure that you can say that the U.S. has a patent strategy or a standard strategy.
I wish we did. I wish we did, Pete.
You wish we did?
Yeah.
Well, perhaps, right. But China clearly does, right? It may be imperfectly implemented, but nevertheless, you know, there's and this goes back to, I think, to my early discussion with that guy, the sense that somewhere along the way, China realized that there was not an enormous amount to be gained by being standard setters and controlling the standards process. And this, you know, was not the level of a particular company or a particular industry. This was a nation, you know, I mean, it was a national strategy. And that's what I think we're beginning to play out. And, you know, it requires, I think, a fair amount of sophisticated response, and much more than we've had so far.
Great.
You know, one of the interesting things is this. You know, you've all referred to, you know, the China as an innovation laggard, and yet, you know, we're all talking about China's technological rise. Let me just ask you quickly: was there a precipitating moment in all of this, where all of a sudden, overnight, seemingly, this transition was made from, you know, they're way behind, they're never going to catch up, to, wow, they're going to eat our lunch? And somehow that transition occurred, and you blink your eye, and it just happened. And, you know, we know that China has been investing huge amounts in R&D, but we also know that money doesn't always buy innovation. We know that China trains a lot of scientists, but they're not all the quality of MIT or Tsinghua or the equivalent. And we know that the Chinese have put in lots of reforms, many of which, you know, have not always had the desired results, as we can see by the admonition coming all the way from the top, from Xi Jinping, about the need to spend more time, more effort on innovation. So somewhere along the way, the question is, are we all looking at the same thing? Are we looking at the same China? Because there are so many different interpretations of what's really going on, and then the metrics that we use. I'd be interested in Pete, you know, a couple comments from you, and then we'll go to Paul and Mark to get a response.
Well, I think it's an interesting question, but I think the simple answer is that it's foreign perceptions that have changed, and why that changed and when and so forth, I'm not entirely sure. But I think that the problem with the many foreign perceptions is they're insensitive to a longer term developmental trajectory that goes back, I mean, go back a long way, but certainly in the post-Mao era, a gradual process of building up capabilities. And that included, you know, talent and human resources. It included policy design. It included institutional reforms and so forth and so on. And then at some point, you know, you kind of reach a kind of nice coherence of all those things, and boom, the system begins to work. And I kind of like one of the points that Dalio made about not always applying Western metrics to all of this. That you really have to, I think, get into the Chinese context much more than we often do when we talk about China's innovation. And I think that's part of the reason why it looks like, the switch has been turned, because all of a sudden it's threatening. But I mean, in a way, it's all been evolving for a long time. And then, things begin to converge in useful ways. So, and for instance, the interaction of government policy, the appearance of entrepreneurial high-tech firms, the relationships between those, educational reforms, the uses of the university as a source of innovation. Lots of things like that have been cooking along, and they have come as a result of, a lot of careful monitoring of what was happening in other countries. And the Chinese keep learning, and they experiment, they fail with some things, and then some other things come together. So I think, that you really need to have a sense of context and development and trajectory and so forth.
Okay. Paul, you want to make a comment? And then
let me make a comment there. I think a good example might be of this is semiconductors. So Dennis mentioned, I think Pete mentioned, this whole idea of Made in China 2025, and about the same time we had this huge national IC investment fund set up. So this created this huge sort of furor in the West, and so for example, the in terms of the National Semiconductor Fund, former Obama Commerce Secretary Penny Pritzker said this is an attempt to appropriate the global supply chain for semiconductors, right? And that precipitated some CFIUS rulings against Chinese companies trying to acquire U.S. companies. And then the Made in China 2025 is also thrown out as, okay, that China wants to indigenize and sets these very aggressive targets, for example, for local production of semiconductors out to 2025. The document that actually did that was a separate document from Made in China 2025. It was a Chinese Academy of Engineering document, a roadmap. And they got together some specialists in the field. And they said, hey, by 2025, if we extrapolate out, this type of semiconductors, by 2025, wouldn't it be nice to have China produced 70% of that category? Now, the problem with that is it had no relationship with markets and with the actual sectors and what was happening. And for example, in 2015, there were no AI semiconductors. And so by the time you fast forward to 2020, the goals in there are now perceived as sort of wildly unrealistic. China's not going to reduce its dependence on U.S. semiconductors by 2025 in almost any of these categories, because there's just a whole bunch of other issues around that, market issues and technology issues, and the fact that Chinese companies can't get access to some of the latest technology. So the Made in China 2025 program sort of made it seem like China wants to dominate this industry and is suddenly becoming a big player here. But the reality of that was much less than meets the eye. Now, the National Investment Fund was a huge government effort, and many in industry still believe that the heavy government subsidies in semiconductors. I mean, there's 40 or more fabs being built now in China, and the Chinese government is going to lose billions of dollars, and only in China can you fritter away billions of dollars on the semiconductor industry. And over time, the argument was that kind of subsidy is going to distort markets and undermine Western companies that are competing in a very competitive sort of market-driven system. And that argument, I think, still holds. But if you look at the reality, again, the amount of money spent by that National IC Investment Fund compared to what the reserves are is pretty small, and there are not a whole lot of successful outcomes from that industrial policy, you can argue, other than maybe in the memory space you have two Chinese companies that may start competing in a small part of that market. So I think going back to what I think Pete said, I mean, a lot of this is sort of this aspirational plans that have been put out over the last 5 years, in the Xi Jinping era in particular, have generated this huge backlash in the West. But if you look at some of the details there's sort of a germ of truth to both arguments. One is, yes, the Chinese want to dominate or become less reliant on the West in these critical technology areas. And to do that, the policies they're adopting are things that like heavy government subsidies. And so that, in fact, led to the whole big part of the trade conflict between the U.S. and China. If you look at the 301 report that came out in April of 2018, it was chock full of references to Made in China 2025 and to issues like semiconductors, right? So those issues have been at the heart, in some sense, of some of the trade conflict and now the technology conflict. But again, if you look at the facts on the ground, also in the last few years, we have ZTE, right, being put on the entity list. And guess what? They're so heavily dependent on US semiconductors that they were almost on the verge of going out of business or declaring bankruptcy because they were so heavily dependent. That sort of set off the light bulbs in China that, maybe their semiconductor industry wasn't that good, and led to a lot of soul searching. And then when you have Huawei added 2 years later or a year later, that has set off this whole process now where over the last couple of weeks in the fifth plenum document and the 14 5-year plan, it's all now about self-reliance on core technologies again in areas like semiconductors. But that doesn't make it any easier. It's still aspirational and it's still hard to do because, ironically, my argument is, these are the sectors that they're trying to become more competitive in are the most market-driven sectors. And so more government money or more government subsidies is not really going to make it's not going to move the needle that far. It can move it marginally, but it's not going to make a huge difference. And so, domestically, there's a lot of soul searching about, what's the way to go here? And does the Chinese semiconductor sector, for example, decouple from the global sector? It's simply not possible. Wei Xiaojun at Tsinghua, who knows the semiconductor industry, basically said that in a really interesting speech this week. He said, we can't. We're integrated now with the global value chains in semiconductors. We can't go it on our own, right? It's too late for that in some sense. You can't recreate all those value chains. But so in the West, the perception has sort of gone back and forth, and that particular sector of China, 800 feet tall, and then realizing that it's not really as tall as it was, but this is an area where the U.S. has been traditionally dominant, and so now the talk is about how to make the U.S. more competitive and keep innovation in the U.S. going while still maintaining access to the China market.
Can I just interject one quick question to Paul?
Okay.
Is a very good point. Is the semiconductor story really typical of the broader phenomenon of Chinese technological catch-up? As I think we know, that the demands are so great in terms of money, in terms of technical sophistication in that industry, that it really is tough. And if we look at semiconductors as sort of a measure of where China is going in innovation, it could be, in fact, a kind of misleading example.
Right.
But I don't know. You're the expert, so
Well, as somebody in Taiwan once told a China observer, 5 years ago, China was 5 years behind Taiwan, and now they're still 5 years behind Taiwan, and in 5 years, they'll still be 5 years behind Taiwan. Semiconductors is really hard to catch up. But there's other areas like telecom equipment. Again, there are these individual areas and sectors where Chinese companies have come up the learning curve and are very competitive. And Huawei is a good example, right? That Huawei that's in part generated a lot of concern in the U.S. about the potential for Huawei to dominate the build out of 5G networks, right? Just in the last 2 years, suddenly 5G became an issue, and Chinese companies' dominance of that became a huge issue and huge national security issue. So and again, Huawei though is not an indigenous Chinese company. They were drawing on all the best technology out there available to them, including U.S. semiconductor design tools and U.S. semiconductor manufacturing equipment that they leverage in Taiwan, for example. So they were very much a good example of a Chinese company that became part of the global value chain and has been very successful. And now, of course, they're looking at trying to develop 5G base stations that have no U.S. technology in it. That's sort of another story. But then I think in areas like AI and quantum computing, the perception there is that China has some advantages there because these are sort of emerging technologies. There's not a huge legacy infrastructure. The barriers to entry are lower, and China has lots of advantages in terms of its education system and access to data for its companies, et cetera. So there, the perception may be right that yes, China is and Chinese companies are going to be very competitive in already are in AI, certain AI applications, and will probably end up being competitive in quantum, although that's a huge issue and much farther out. But there, the R&D that China is doing in that area is very advanced.
Hey, let me make sure that we have one question that's been holding on for a while from the audience about supply chains. We've referred to decoupling or delinking throughout this discussion, and the question is really, do we see evidence that there's really a reconfiguration of the global supply chain going on, in which China is going to be, the last man standing? In other words, that companies are starting to become less reliant on China, and that there is a significant march out of the Chinese supply chain infrastructure. Do we see any of that going on?
Yes, so I can answer that, Dennis. Phil Rogers and I at Berkeley have been looking a lot at this topic. And if you're looking at products made over extended supply chains, there's about 625 of them identified by the United Nations. And China has a leading role, about a third of the global market share. But other places, including surprisingly Mexico, is way up there with about 20% of the market share. We're looking at things like semiconductors, like automobiles, like testing equipment, like ICT equipment. You go to industry surveys in China, and they almost uniformly say, 2%, 3% are thinking of relocating, very small margins. But if you go to surveys taken outside of China, folks will say, yeah, 15, 20% or more may say we're going to relocate. They may actually be talking not about disinvestment, but about locating new, more resilient supply sources. This is a different kind of consideration from pulling stuff out of China. China is very hard to displace as a player in global supply chains. It's not only as a country, often as a province or a municipality, where you have a large degree of integration of manufacturing. Furthermore, if you start looking at other countries that could displace China, you're left with maybe Mexico because of the US-Mexico-Canada free trade agreement, and possibly India because of the size of its market. But any other market, and Vietnam has picked up a lot, but when you look at countries like Vietnam or Thailand or Indonesia, for them to grab 1% of China's lunch would be a big boost in their participation in global supply chains. So yes, they are playing a much bigger role. They're starting from a very low level, but if they want to integrate with other suppliers, you're talking about crossing national borders and FTAs and tariffs and languages and all these other issues that make it very, very difficult to replicate China. So yes, companies are looking at more resilient supply chains. The Trump tariffs have imposed high costs and a sense of risk associated with China, but China is extremely hard to replace.
Okay. Anyone else? Paul, you want a quick comment?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. I think in many cases, for example, with the tariffs, what we saw were companies moving around, where they were producing things. So for example, to avoid tariffs, they would produce semiconductors or package semiconductors in the Philippines. Intel comes to mind. Package stuff in the Philippines for the U.S. market, and then so a lot of companies have played with their supply chains to avoid the tariffs, for example. But I totally agree with Mark that China's this huge manufacturing power. I mean, it's like a $3 trillion manufacturing economy, and so it's good logistics, and there's this huge concentration of manufacturing there that you can't easily displace. Vietnam can only absorb so much. It comes down to education and the personnel you need, educated personnel, depending on the sophistication of a manufacturing operation. So China has so many advantages there that there's definitely been a diversification of supply chains, but a massive sort of exodus from China has not really happened. I mean, the U.S. supply chain issue is a little more complicated. There's a desire there to just sort of reduce dependence on China, particularly for sort of, the U.S. military, for example, reduce dependence on China. And that's something that they'll do through other means and attracting companies to come to the U.S. and build, like TSMC to build a fab in Arizona. So that's a separate issue. But yeah, I mean, Mark is spot on that very difficult to sort of, design China out of your manufacturing supply chain. And again, this depends on the sector, and there'll be differences depending on what kinds of.
And that's not to say, Dennis, that if you were a policymaker in Vietnam or Thailand or Indonesia, that you wouldn't be pining away to grab some of China's share and do whatever you can. And you may very well grab a piece of it for many reasons, but that's not going to eat that much into what China produces or how it participates.
Okay. Why don't we I'm going to give you each one last question to end our session. In the recent fifth plenum at the 19th Congress, the language of discourse by Xi Jinping took on this focus back to a Cultural Revolution term called Zili Gongsheng, or self-reliance. As you may recall, this had been made sort of obsolete when the indigenous innovation language of Zizhu Chuangxin started to be used. And so the question is the United States fostering a kind of fait accompli instead of bringing China back into the mainstream of global commerce, industry, technology? Are we in effect stepping on our own foot and putting China right back where we found it at the end of the Cultural Revolution, into this posture of being more nervous and more worried and et cetera, so that the China that we're going to see in the future is going to be rather xenophobic, rather anxious, and really worried that it's going to be locked out of the global S&T system in ways that could produce this kind of adversarial relationship that we've been looking for 40 years to try to avoid. And so just a quick comment from each of you as kind of a parting set of words, that would be great. Why don't I start with Pete?
Well, I think that the China now is faced with a really difficult kind of a contradiction. Because on one hand, you have all this attention being given to self-reliance, but on the other hand, you also hear lots of policy statements celebrating the importance of international cooperation. But in terms of foreign policy and political initiatives, China seems to be ensuring that cooperation is not going to be so forthcoming, as we begin to see more and more caution being exercised, certainly by most countries throughout the OECD world. But I think that the important thing in all of this is to kind of keep looking very carefully, not only at those kinds of elite statements from Xi Jinping, but also what is the planning process producing. I mean, we're about to see a whole new introduction of a medium to long-term plan for science and technology, and we know a little bit about that. But there's a lot of very interesting dimensions to that, some of which lend themselves, I think, to international cooperation and U.S.-China cooperation. Others probably not. But it seems to me that the Chinese don't have their story straight.
Okay. Mark?
Yeah, so, Zili Gongsheng is back, self-reliance is back. Maybe it never fully left the scene. It's from an IP perspective, it's hard to see where this really ends up. I mean, we do see a lot of collaborative research. We do see joint patenting. And we see many areas where we're still joined at the hip, even if we may want some modicum of separation. I think it's really hard also to say that China is becoming xenophobic and not acknowledge that, in fact, the U.S. has become increasingly xenophobic as well, certainly in our prosecution of Chinese nationals under the Economic Espionage Act, and our belief that international institutions such as the WTO, UN, and other organizations are not being well served, are not serving us well, even as China participates more actively in them. I think all of this, plus the lack, and we haven't spoken about this so much, the lack of a real focus, particularly until recently, on some kind of self-strengthening. I mean, even our IP system has gotten weaker in the US measurably in the last 10 or 15 years, to the point where many patent lawyers say we should be like China. Even while at the same time USTR is saying we lost $600 billion due to Chinese IP theft. This is utterly contradictory. This is a real Malduin that we haven't worked out in our system. And that was the reason I said, by the way, Dennis, I wish we had a 5-year plan. I wish our Supreme Court would read it when they make decisions on important intellectual property issues, because it would help them rather than taking pot shots at what they think economic policy would be. It would help them in getting a sense of the future. So it's not altogether clear to me where this all lands. I think China can regrettably go into a more nationalistic mode, and we've seen how that has worked out in the past. Not well for China, not well for the rest of the world. But unfortunately, the US is also being a bit of a norm setter, a regrettable norm setter in this area. And hopefully President Biden, once he comes fully to power, can help bring us out of that modality.
Great. Okay, last comment to Paul.
Well, I would just say, I think on both sides, the goalposts have changed. So in China, the last 4 years, the Huawei, ZTE, whatever episode, there is this sense that, yeah, we need to really double down on self-reliance on core technologies. And so Xi's language here, verbiage, is very much a signal to the bureaucracy to, yes, again, this is a huge thing. So really redouble your efforts here. But as I said earlier, and depending on the sector you're talking about, it still doesn't make it any easier for them to suddenly become and any time in the near term, self-sufficient in semiconductors. But yeah, clearly that they've decided that the U.S. goalposts have changed, which they have, and so they're gonna operate on that principle. In the U.S., the goalposts have changed, so China is now seen as a threat in the technology space, and so the real question under a Biden administration will be, what's the landing zone here? The problem with the Trump approach was, going after companies and going after different technology sectors, but there didn't seem to be a coherent strategy as to, what the new norm was in relation to China. So many have argued that, have a small area, protect and put high walls around it. So really focus on those technologies that are of critical national security importance and protect those, and then in other areas work on, and to push China on the trade, all the issues around trade that we've discussed that were part of the whole phase 1 and phase 2 trade deals, which I think a Biden team will eventually get around to going back to, but come up with a more coherent China strategy so that companies, and particularly the companies I deal with on a day-to-day basis, have a little more clarity around the direction of change here. I mean, this administration has basically said to U.S. companies, if you're doing business in China, you're supporting the goals of the Chinese Communist Party, right? And so that sort of rhetoric, I think, will be toned down here. But nevertheless, the national security piece of the U.S.-China relationship has been fundamentally changed, and finding a sort of a balance between national security and economic security is going to be the real challenge, I think, of the new Biden administration, because it's not going to go back. We're not going back to to engagement under Obama and Clinton, Obama and 43 here. We're in a new era, so they're going to have to develop a new strategy to cope with China as it is, but not sort of shoot U.S. industry in the foot at the same time, which we've seen sort of happen with this administration.
Well, if there's one
confused and uncertain
silver lining in the cloud, it may be, there's this China Task Force Act that just came out. There are 137 separate bills and provisions that have been launched now as a response to the so-called China threat. Add to that the Chips for America, Endless Frontier Act, America Leads Act. I mean, there may be the beginnings of a U.S. effort to get itself together. And then hopefully under a Biden administration, there would be more coherence and greater logic connecting all the pieces together. And not just a response to China, but a response to, the entire U.S. international posture. So anyway, I thank everyone, our three panelists tonight. I thank our audience for those who've stayed with us for this time. I want to thank the National Committee of U.S.-China Relations for giving us the chance to join their town hall. And again, I want to thank all the organizations at Duke and also at Berkeley that were kind enough to lend their support. And I look forward to hearing more from our panelists. And I'm sure these issues are not going away for a long time to come. So thank you, everyone, and have a great evening. Good night now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis.
Yeah.